The old oak loomed over the Louisiana plantation like a silent sentinel, its gnarled branches stretching wide as if to grasp the sun itself. Chains that had once bound countless enslaved men clinked faintly in memory, whispering stories of broken backs and broken spirits. Cato stood at the edge of the yard, hands scarred from labor, eyes sharp with the knowledge of years spent surviving under Master Beauregard's cruelty. To the world, he was a compliant, strong-bodied slave, obedient in his work, silent in his suffering. Yet beneath that quiet exterior, a mind sharpened by observation, endurance, and rage had begun plotting a patient, inevitable justice. This is the story of how one enslaved man turned the oak that had witnessed his oppression into the instrument of his master's undoing. Before we enter deeper into this tale of patient vengeance and calculated retribution, where are you watching from? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment, and if the stories of deliberate, intelligent revenge fascinate you, hit subscribe, because what you are about to hear has been hidden in the shadows of history. Cato had been born in the sweltering heat of Louisiana in 1818. His earliest memories a blur of cotton fields, lash marks, and the barked orders of overseers. From a young age, he learned that survival depended not on defiance, but on keen observation, patience, and the careful cultivation of invisibility. His body was strong, honed by years of labor in the fields and stables. But it was his mind that became his true instrument. Every order, every punishment, every slight and insult was catalogued, stored, and analyzed. To survive in Master Beauregard's household required more than physical endurance. It demanded an intelligence that could anticipate cruelty, manipulate perception, and convert oppression into latent power. The master himself was a man whose arrogance equaled his cruelty. He ruled the estate with an iron hand, his authority unquestioned, his punishments swift and public. He took pride in the visible obedience of his slaves, believing that fear alone was enough to maintain control. Yet he underestimated the intelligence of those he bound and disciplined, believing their silence and physical labor to be mere compliance. Cato, having endured decades under such authority, knew better. He understood that patience, observation, and the slow accumulation of knowledge could cultivate a power invisible to the master until the moment it became undeniable. The estate was a sprawling landscape of fields, quarters, stables, and the central house, all meticulously mapped in Cato's mind. The giant oak tree at the edge of the yard held a special significance. Its thick branches had once been used to chain men like him, to humiliate and subjugate them in full view of the estate's inhabitants. Yet in that tree, Cato also saw potential, leverage, control, and ultimately, justice. Over the years, he studied every contour of the yard, every shadow cast by the oak, and every routine that passed beneath its branches. The tree became a silent ally in his mind, a witness to suffering and a waiting instrument for inevitable retribution. The other enslaved people on the estate were both obstacles and assets. Some were too fearful to intervene, some too accustomed to oppression to imagine resistance, and yet others could be relied upon, cautiously, to assist in subtle ways. Cato learned to read the signs, a glance, a delay in a chore, a whispered remark. These tiny gestures, seemingly inconsequential, revealed loyalty, intelligence, and understanding. They would become critical in the orchestration of the master's eventual downfall. The patience he demanded of himself extended to nurturing these subtle alliances, recognizing that a network of silent complicity would be essential to executing a plan that had been decades in the making. Cato's daily routine in the fields, stables, and quarters became an exercise in observation as much as survival. He memorized the timing of the master's inspections, the predictable intervals of the overseer's patrols, and the subtle shifts in the household's hierarchy. Every object, from tools to stable equipment to the chains of the oak itself, was studied for its potential utility in a plan that had yet to fully unfold. His patience transformed what appeared to be monotony into the meticulous study of environment, human behavior, and opportunity. Physical endurance was only half of Cato's preparation. Psychological insight became his greatest weapon. He learned the triggers that provoked anger, the subtle cracks in the master's confidence, and the predictable patterns of his authority. Over time, Cato cataloged each flaw, each overreach, and each predictable response. What the master considered dominance and control became, in Cato's mind, a series of vulnerabilities waiting to be exploited with intelligence, patience, and precise timing. The oak tree, with its thick, weathered branches and sprawling canopy, became the symbol of both oppression and potential liberation. Cato would often pause beneath its shade, feeling the rough bark under his palms, recalling the countless moments when chains had bit into skin and freedom had been a distant fantasy. Yet with each reflection, he also plotted the inversion of power, the transformation of a tool of subjugation into an instrument of justice. Every crack in the branches, every sturdy limb, every space in the roots, was catalogued for future use. It became as essential to his plan as any human participant or manipulated object within the household. Even the routine of feeding, cleaning, and attending to the master and household staff became opportunities for subtle observation. Each movement, each gesture, each predictable action was mentally noted and integrated into a larger blueprint. Years of endured cruelty had honed Cato's patience and intellect, enabling him to see the estate not just as a place of suffering, but as a landscape that could be transformed into a stage for justice. The eventual night of reckoning would require perfect timing, precise manipulation, and the coordination of both people and environment. Every day of submission was, paradoxically, a rehearsal, a preparation for the eventual inversion of power. By evening, when the plantation settled into its rhythmic quiet and the last lights were extinguished in the quarters, Cato often stood beneath the oak, the chains long gone but their memory vivid. He traced his hands along the bark, feeling the years of subjugation, the echoes of suffering, and the potential for retribution. In that silence, he rehearsed scenarios, anticipated obstacles, and refined contingencies. The master believed he was untouchable, invincible, and omnipotent. Cato, patient and intelligent, knew otherwise. Cato was no longer merely a slave. He had become a strategist, an observer, and a quiet architect of inevitable justice. The oak tree, the routines of the estate, the predictable arrogance of the master, and the silent complicity of allies, all had been catalogued and rehearsed over years of endurance and intelligence. The eventual reckoning was still distant, but the foundation had been laid. Patience, observation, and precise planning had converged to create a path toward retribution that was as inevitable as it was calculated. Every chain broken, every wound endured, and every observation recorded contributed to the architecture of justice that would one day transform suffering into decisive action. The sun rose over the Louisiana plantation, casting its fiery light across the vast expanse of cotton fields and the imposing main house. To the master, Cato moved through the day as he always had, obedient, strong, and seemingly docile, performing every task assigned to him with precision, yet without question. But beneath this carefully maintained exterior, Cato's mind was alive with observation, analysis, and the patient accumulation of knowledge. Every command, every glance, every subtle nuance of the household's daily operations became a piece of the puzzle he was slowly assembling, a puzzle that would one day overturn decades of cruelty. Cato had learned to navigate the dangerous terrain of fear, authority, and subtle influence. Each overseer's patrol, each visit from Master Beauregard, and each minor household disruption were opportunities for observation. He noted how his master's mood shifted with the arrival of visitors, how easily the master's authority could be challenged in private moments, and the precise timing of routines that he had once thought mundane. Each of these observations was a step toward understanding the vulnerabilities inherent in the system that oppressed him. The oak tree, which had witnessed years of punishment, humiliation, and bondage, now became a symbol of foresight and patient strategy. Cato often returned to its massive trunk, tracing his hands along its rough bark, feeling the weight of history and the silent promise of eventual justice. Its branches had once restrained him, but in his mind, they became instruments of inevitability, holding within their reach the potential to invert the power dynamics of the entire estate. Every crevice in the roots, every knot in the trunk, every sturdy limb was studied, measured, and memorized. This tree, silent yet enduring, was as crucial to his plan as any person who might assist him. Allies among the enslaved workers were identified with meticulous care. Some were cautious, some observant, and some, like him, burdened with knowledge of cruelty and injustice. Each one was subtly assessed. Who could be trusted to act discreetly, who would follow a subtle cue without question, and who could contribute to the orchestration without betraying the plan. Silent communication, a glance, a delayed response, or an inconspicuous adjustment became a language of complicity. Over time, Cato had built a network of tacit support that would amplify his influence and ensure that his eventual actions were both precise and uncontested. In the household, the master's routines were predictably rigid. He moved through rooms in set sequences, inspected the fields at fixed intervals, and relied on the obedience of his staff as if their compliance were a guarantee of loyalty. Cato cataloged each step, each gesture, and each habitual pause. He recognized that these routines, which the master considered a demonstration of control, were actually his greatest vulnerability. Patience became Cato's weapon. By waiting, observing, and recording, he accumulated power, invisible to those who underestimated him. The nursery, where the infant heir slept, remained a focal point of observation. From his quiet vantage, Cato could monitor the interactions of the master with the child, noting patterns of authority, neglect, and overconfidence. He cataloged how servants responded to instructions, how the master reacted to deviations from expectation, and how even minor environmental changes could provoke subtle shifts in behavior. These insights became the basis for psychological manipulation, a crucial layer of strategy that would ensure the inevitability of his future actions. Subtle manipulations began to take shape in his daily life. A misaligned tool, a strategically delayed chore, or a small, controlled disruption could test reactions without drawing suspicion. These minor acts, invisible to the master, created openings and reinforced the patterns of predictability that Cato would exploit. The household was a stage, and every movement, every glance, and every response was part of a rehearsal for the larger act of vengeance that had been decades in the making. Cato's endurance and intelligence were tested daily. Physical labor and public humiliation were constant, yet they became exercises in strategy rather than mere suffering. He observed, adapted, and internalized lessons with every interaction. Each beating, each insult, and each imposed laborer's routine fed into a growing blueprint for retribution. Pain became information, and endurance became preparation. In his patient silence, Cato accumulated both knowledge and power, waiting for the precise alignment of opportunity, timing, and environment. The enslaved allies, now subtly integrated into his plan, played their parts without overt action. Their quiet complicity ensured that the environment could be influenced without revealing the architect behind it. Even the smallest gestures, a glance, a delayed response, a feigned mistake reinforced the inevitability of Cato's strategy. Each participant's behavior, seemingly natural, contributed to a framework in which the master's downfall could be executed flawlessly when the moment arrived. By nightfall, the plantation settled into its familiar rhythms. Lanterns flickered, dogs wandered lazily through the yards, and the master retired with his assumptions intact. Cato, beneath the shadow of the oak, reviewed every observation of the day. The alignment of routines, the cooperation of allies, and the vulnerabilities he had cataloged formed a mental blueprint that would guide him when the decisive night arrived. Every day of silent vigilance had refined his understanding, strengthened his patience, and brought the inevitability of revenge one step closer. Cato was no longer merely a victim of cruelty. He had become a strategist, a silent orchestrator, and an invisible architect of justice. Every object, every person, and every predictable routine had been transformed in his mind into instruments of inevitable consequence. The night of reckoning was approaching, and the foundation laid through silent vigilance and careful observation ensured that, when the time came, vengeance would be executed with precision, intelligence, and unwavering inevitability. By the 6th year of Cato's bondage, patience had become his greatest weapon. The oak tree, the yard, the routines of the master, and the silent compliance of fellow enslaved workers were no longer mere elements of survival. They were pieces in a vast, intricate puzzle that he had been assembling for years. Every insult endured, every lash absorbed, and every day of servitude had sharpened his mind, honed his awareness, and reinforced the inevitability of eventual justice. Cato understood that impulsive action would be futile. True retribution required patience, strategy, and precision, the qualities that had sustained him through years of subjugation. Cato began to design the mechanics of his revenge. The master, arrogant and predictable, trusted both the structure of the estate and the obedience of his slaves. Cato mapped the routines meticulously. When Beauregard would visit the stables, inspect the fields, or retire to his private chambers, when overseers patrolled, and which staff were present in key locations at precise intervals. Every movement was noted, every habitual pause catalogued, until the master's life seemed a series of patterns waiting to be exploited. His strategy relied upon exploiting these patterns, turning the master's overconfidence against him, and using the estate itself as a stage for his patient orchestration. Materials and tools were gathered carefully, under the guise of routine labor. Cato repurposed items normally used for daily work ropes, stables' pulleys, chains, and even the oak tree itself into instruments of precise control. Nothing was left to chance. He rehearsed in his mind how each element would interact, how a rope could hold the master, how his weight could be guided by leverage, how silent accomplices could subtly manipulate doors, gates, or animals to ensure no opportunity for escape. Each scenario was mentally simulated repeatedly, the variables anticipated and contingencies rehearsed with exacting detail. Cato also considered psychological manipulation. He studied the master's pride, arrogance, and predictable reactions to perceived disorder. Beauregard's insistence on absolute obedience and his over-reliance on routine provided opportunities for subtle nudges, carefully orchestrated misdirections, and controlled distractions. Each act was timed to exploit the master's arrogance, to amplify confusion, and to ensure the inevitability of his downfall. By leveraging his deep understanding of human behavior, Cato transformed the household itself into an instrument of retribution. Allies among the enslaved workers were slowly integrated into the plan, each chosen for reliability, discretion, and understanding of subtle cues. A glance here, a slight delay there, a minor rearrangement of an object, all became part of a silent communication system. The network of complicity ensured that the plan's execution would be both effective and invisible. No single individual would bear blame. Every action would appear natural or accidental, while collectively achieving a meticulously orchestrated outcome. The power of patient observation and silent collaboration became evident in the way small, seemingly inconsequential movements were strategically amplified. Cato's patience extended beyond the physical and logistical. He mentally rehearsed sequences repeatedly, testing them in imagination against every potential variation of human behavior. He envisioned the master's responses, the reactions of allies, the subtle interplay of environmental variables, and the alignment of timing required to execute vengeance flawlessly. Years of endured cruelty had taught him that emotional impulse could ruin a plan. The act of retribution had to be precise, deliberate, and psychologically unavoidable. The oak tree, silent witness to decades of suffering, had been selected as the central element of the strategy. Its massive branches could support leverage, hold weight, and guide the master into a position of complete vulnerability. Cato measured angles, considered strength and tension, and simulated the mechanics in his mind. Even the smallest irregularity, a knot in the rope, a crack in a branch, was accounted for, ensuring that the physical aspects of his plan were as precise as the psychological manipulations guiding them. Environmental manipulation became a secondary instrument of control. Cato studied the estate at night, observing how shadows moved across the yard, how animals reacted to human presence, and how light and sound could be subtly influenced to create confusion or distraction at the critical moment. Every tree, gate, and building became a potential amplifier of his strategy, ensuring that when the plan was executed, the estate itself would function as a tool of inevitability. By the evening, Cato stood beneath the oak, tracing its bark, and envisioning the culmination of years of observation, patience, and calculated endurance. Each member of the household, each object, and each predictable routine had been analyzed, rehearsed, and integrated into a blueprint for action. His mind was a chessboard, the master a piece trapped by the invisible web Cato had woven. The act of revenge would not be chaotic. It would be the inevitable product of years of patience, intelligence, and silent orchestration. Cato was no longer merely a victim of cruelty. He had become a strategist, an architect of inevitability, and a patient executor of justice. The oak, the routines of the estate, the psychological weaknesses of the master, and the tacit collaboration of trusted allies all converged into a precise plan of vengeance. Every observation, every small act of survival, and every endured insult contributed to the moment when suffering would be transformed into decisive, calculated justice. The night of reckoning was still distant, but the foundation had been laid. Deliberate action, strategic manipulation, and patient orchestration would ensure that cruelty would meet its inevitable consequence. By the 7th year of Cato's forced life on the Louisiana plantation, his strategy had begun to shift from observation to subtle manipulation. The estate, sprawling with cotton fields, stables, and the imposing main house, had become a canvas upon which he could quietly orchestrate chaos without revealing his hand. Each day, he moved through the familiar routines with the precision of someone who understood that the smallest deviation could catalyze the largest outcome. The master, confident in his authority, remained oblivious, blinded by arrogance and routine, unaware that every action was being silently countered by patience and intelligence. Cato's sabotage began in minor ways. Tools in the stables were misaligned to cause slight delays. Feeding schedules were subtly altered. Gates and doors were left slightly ajar, enough to confuse without inviting suspicion. These interventions seemed insignificant to any observer, yet they were carefully calculated to test reactions, weaken confidence, and reinforce the psychological patterns that Cato would exploit in the decisive moment. Every small disruption was measured, timed, and mentally catalogued to observe how the master and his household responded to deviations from their predictable routines. Allies among the enslaved workers became indispensable in these small acts of sabotage. A quiet glance, a delayed chore, a subtly misplaced object, each was a communication tool in an invisible network of complicity. Those who could be trusted were encouraged to act without drawing attention, creating minor disturbances that contributed to the inevitable psychological unraveling of the master. Their participation, though subtle, ensured that Cato's eventual actions would be amplified and that no single person could be blamed if the plan succeeded. The master, Beauregard, began to show signs of unease. Small disruptions, an overturned bucket, a misaligned tool, the mysterious absence of a stable horse provoked irritation, tension, and frustration. He could not identify a cause, nor anticipate the orchestration behind these minor irritations. To Cato, this was validation. The psychological tension he had anticipated was building, the groundwork for the master's eventual downfall solidifying. Each display of anger, each frustrated outburst, was a rehearsal in patience and timing, further refining the execution of the plan. Cato continued his meticulous observation of human behavior. He studied not only the master but also the household staff, noting loyalties, fears, and tendencies. Who hesitated under scrutiny? Who moved predictably? Who could be counted upon to maintain silence when confronted? These mental assessments guided subtle interventions designed to strengthen the inevitability of the eventual act of retribution. The subtle sabotage was not random. It was a continuation of years-long observation transformed into calculated manipulation, creating a controlled environment in which the master would eventually fall. The oak tree, a silent witness to decades of cruelty and humiliation, now became an integral part of the mental and physical planning. Cato traced its limbs, estimated the strength of each branch, and calculated how every part of the tree could contribute to controlling the master when the decisive moment arrived. It had been the site of his bondage, the instrument of past suffering, and now, through patient observation and manipulation, it would become the fulcrum of justice. The integration of environment and human psychology into a single coordinated strategy reflected Cato's intelligence, patience, and foresight. Nightly rehearsals in Cato's mind became a form of rehearsal for the eventual climax. Each small sabotage, every misaligned item, every delayed task was simulated in his imagination to predict outcomes and refine timing. He considered variables like the master's reactions, the positioning of allies, the alignment of the household's routines, and even the timing of natural elements such as wind and moonlight. Every rehearsal brought greater precision, ensuring that the night of reckoning would be executed flawlessly. Even the smallest gestures within the household carried significance. A slave adjusting a door slightly, a horse nudged in the wrong direction, or a misplaced tool in the yard could become a crucial element of the larger orchestration. Each seemingly insignificant act was part of a symphony of controlled chaos, building tension and uncertainty in the mind of the master while preserving Cato's invisibility. The deliberate subtlety of these actions ensured that the master remained unaware that the very estate he controlled had become a theater of inevitable justice. By evening, the plantation appeared calm. Lanterns flickered along the main house, shadows danced across the stables, and the night carried the familiar sounds of cicadas and distant fieldwork. Yet beneath this veneer of tranquility, the deliberate sabotage of the day had left the master slightly unbalanced, cautious, and increasingly frustrated. Cato observed from the shadows, noting every reaction, every micro-expression, and every subtle hesitation. These observations refined the final blueprint of action, ensuring that the psychological and environmental conditions were aligned for the eventual execution of precise, patient vengeance. Cato's patience, intelligence, and meticulous orchestration had transformed the estate itself into a controlled instrument. Every disruption, every subtle misalignment, every cooperative glance from trusted allies reinforced the inevitability of what was to come. The master remained unaware that his arrogance, cruelty, and predictable routines had become his undoing. The stage was set. The oak, the estate, and the people within it had been silently prepared for the night of judgment, when years of observation, subtle sabotage, and patient calculation would converge to deliver precise, unflinching retribution. The night fell over the Louisiana plantation with a suffocating stillness, heavy with the humidity of late summer and the lingering scent of cotton and earth. Lanterns flickered across the yard and the main house, illuminating shadows that seemed to twist with anticipation. To the master, the estate appeared calm, obedient, and predictable. He remained confident, convinced in the supremacy of his control over both property and people. Yet beneath the surface, the patient orchestration of Cato and his silent allies was poised to converge, transforming routine into calculated inevitability. The night of justice had arrived. Cato moved like a shadow through the familiar paths of the estate, his body silent and his mind precise. Every step, every breath, every glance was rehearsed for years. The minor sabotages of previous months had subtly destabilized the master's perception, priming him for disorientation and miscalculation. Allies remained in carefully assigned positions, ready to act or retreat according to subtle cues. Their tacit participation amplified the effectiveness of the plan, without revealing a single trace of orchestration. The household, seemingly unchanged, had been transformed into a theater of inevitability. The oak tree, long a symbol of bondage and humiliation, now became the instrument of justice. Its thick, gnarled limbs had borne chains in the past. Now they were integral to the execution of Cato's carefully plotted vengeance. He had measured each branch, each knot, and each angle for optimal leverage. Every physical detail of the tree, every contour, every space between roots, and every sturdy limb had been catalogued for the exact moment when it would become the fulcrum of retribution. This tree, a silent witness for decades, was ready to witness the reversal of power in precise, deliberate action. Cato's psychological manipulations of the master had also reached their climax. Subtle disorientations from the day misaligned tools, delayed tasks, minor disruptions had frayed the master's confidence and increased his reliance on predictable routines. His overconfidence now worked against him. He reacted with irritation and tension to minor inconveniences, unknowingly reinforcing the effectiveness of Cato's plan. Every frustration, every hesitant movement, and every involuntary pause was anticipated, creating a convergence of environmental and psychological conditions that would guarantee the inevitability of justice. The enslaved allies executed their parts with quiet precision. One nudged an improperly secured gate, another adjusted the placement of a lantern to cast misleading shadows, while a third subtly misdirected the master's path in the yard. Each action seemed incidental, but was meticulously orchestrated to guide the master toward the location where Cato would execute his final act. These subtle interventions ensured both the invisibility of the plot and the precise alignment of conditions necessary for success. Every person, every movement, and every environmental factor played a critical role in the orchestration of revenge. Cato finally approached the master, appearing in the yard with deliberate calm. He moved with strength and decisiveness, yet without haste, ensuring that every element of the environment supported the plan. The master, distracted by minor disturbances, remained unaware of the impending convergence. The branches of the oak tree loomed above, a silent enforcer of inevitability. Ropes and pulleys, subtly manipulated and previously rehearsed in Cato's mind, were ready to fulfill their role. The culmination of years of observation, patience, and planning was about to be realized. Every gesture and step had been anticipated. The master's predictable arrogance led him to underestimate the precision of Cato's actions. As the final sequence unfolded, the master found himself restrained by the very instruments he once used to impose control. The tree, the ropes, and the environment worked in harmony, ensuring that the outcome was both inescapable and exacting. Allies remained silent, reinforcing the inevitability without risking detection. The act was not impulsive, not chaotic. It was the product of years of intelligence, careful observation, and strategic manipulation. By midnight, the master had been neutralized. The estate appeared outwardly unchanged, yet the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. Cato's patient orchestration ensured that justice had been delivered with precision, intelligence, and methodical calculation. No chaos, no unnecessary exposure, only the deliberate culmination of long-sustained patience and observation. The household staff, while unaware of the full extent of the plan, sensed a subtle but permanent change in the dynamics of control, an invisible shift that heralded the end of tyranny. Cato remained calm, silent, and undetected, a master of patience and strategy. The oak tree, once a symbol of subjugation, now stood as a witness to the inevitability of justice. The estate, once ruled by fear and cruelty, had been subtly but irrevocably transformed. The night had demonstrated the power of observation, intelligence, and silent complicity. Cruelty and arrogance had been met with patient, deliberate, and precise retribution. Cato had turned decades of suffering into a carefully executed act of justice, ensuring that the consequences of cruelty were not only realized but inevitable. The first light of dawn filtered through the sprawling Louisiana plantation, casting long shadows across fields that had once echoed with the rhythm of labor and the harsh cries of authority. The estate appeared outwardly unchanged. Tools were in their usual places, gates remained closed, and the morning chores resumed with a semblance of normality. Yet beneath this facade, the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. Master Beauregard, once the embodiment of arrogance and control, was no more. The carefully orchestrated, years-long plan of patient observation and meticulous manipulation had culminated in a precise, inescapable act of justice. Cato had disappeared by first light, moving quietly through the landscape of shadows he knew intimately. His identity, once bound to the estate and its chains, had been shed as he adopted a new guise, one that allowed him to move unseen and untraceable. The network of enslaved allies he had cultivated remained, silently complicit in preserving the secrecy of his actions. Their subtle participation ensured that no evidence could be traced back to him, while the psychological ripple of the night's events reverberated throughout the household. The message was clear: cruelty, arrogance, and overconfidence had consequences that could not be evaded. Within the quarters, whispers spread quietly among the enslaved. Cato's name, though never openly spoken, became synonymous with patience, intelligence, and strategic retribution. Stories circulated of how he had observed, waited, and finally acted with unerring precision. The network of silent complicity, the subtle manipulations of the environment, and the patient study of human behavior were recounted as lessons in survival and justice. Elders in the quarters taught these stories to the young, not as instruction for immediate revenge, but as a demonstration of the power inherent in patience, intelligence, and careful orchestration. The master's absence left a void that initially caused confusion and fear among the staff and overseers. Questions lingered. Had there been a supernatural event? An accident? Divine intervention? Some suspected subtle sabotage, but none could identify the orchestrator. Cato's careful planning ensured that all traces of his actions remained invisible. By controlling both environment and ally behavior, he had left the estate outwardly intact, yet the psychological imprint of his vengeance would endure. The once unassailable authority of the master had been permanently dismantled, replaced by an invisible acknowledgement of Cato's strategic intelligence. Beyond the estate, the tale of the master's demise slowly seeped into neighboring plantations. Stories of the powerful, patient slave who had turned the instruments of his bondage into the tools of justice were whispered with caution. Fear, respect, and admiration mingled in these accounts. Masters became wary of overconfidence, understanding that arrogance and cruelty could be undone by patient intelligence and meticulous observation. The narrative of Cato's patient orchestration became a cautionary tale, a reminder that the oppressed could wield power silently and with inevitability. Cato himself continued his journey, adopting a new identity, traveling quietly, and blending into communities that offered both safety and anonymity. The knowledge he had accumulated of human behavior, of environmental manipulation, and of subtle influence remained his shield and his instrument. He became invisible, yet omnipresent in the consciousness of those who had once oppressed him. Each step he took reflected the culmination of patience, observation, and strategic thinking. The years of endurance had transformed into actionable power, executed with precision and without chaos. Decades later, the story of Cato persisted in hushed tones, preserved in the memory of those who had witnessed or heard of his calculated retribution. He was remembered as a strategist, a patient executor of justice, and a man who had converted suffering into deliberate action. The oak tree, once a symbol of chains and subjugation, became a quiet emblem of inevitability, a reminder that time, observation, and intelligence could transform even oppression into opportunity. Cato's legacy endured not through public records or court documents, but in the whispered acknowledgement of his patient orchestration, a blueprint for justice born of meticulous planning, silent complicity, and the inexorable inevitability of revenge executed with precision. The plantation, superficially restored to routine, carried invisible scars. The power dynamics had shifted, the fear of the unseen lingered, and the lesson of patient, intelligent revenge endured. Cato's actions had rewritten the narrative of power within the estate. Cruelty could be met with calculated consequence. Suffering could be transformed into strategic action, and the seemingly powerless could engineer justice with the precision of a mind honed by patience, observation, and unyielding resolve. In the end, the chains may have bound his body, but they had never bound his intellect, patience, or the inevitability of the justice he would exact.